Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our new series of Shiurim given by Rabbi Rashi Simon. Rabbi Simon, along with his wife Ruthie, lead the Kesher Shul and community in North West London. In addition, Rabbi Simon is an engaging teacher and educator on a wide variety of Torah and other topics. At NER, we know Rabbi Simon best from his series of talks bringing to life some of our most important rabbinical teachers from across history. So we're delighted to welcome Rabbi Simon back for a new series of Sages from the Ages. I guess I will mention, but there are some handouts for those in the room, but there's no online equivalent, so you'll just have to listen more intently. Thank you very much, Rabbi Simon.
Thank you, Neil, for your kind words of introduction. It is a pleasure to be here at Tanai Israel once again. I was just reminiscing how I first taught here more than 25 years ago, believe it or not. And we certainly did not have Zoom in those days, especially since it was on a Shabbos afternoon. But that was then, and things have moved on in terms of the technology. And Jewish history, in its own way, has also moved on in the sense that history has further unfolded in the last 25 years. But our subject this evening is going to be the first of a series of 5 sages of the ages. I'll just hold up the flyer here. I'm sure everyone here knows about it, but just for those who are tuning in online, it's Sages of the Ages. And we are going to explore the life and legacy of 5 important and influential Torah personalities. Tonight, we're going to look at Keli Yakar. We'll learn a lot more about him in the next hour or so. Next week, Or HaChaim, Vilna Gaon, Malbim, and Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch. So those are coming attractions. And of course, everyone is very welcome. And thank you again for inviting me here tonight. So those who are in the room at least should have a copy of source material in front of you. So our subject, as we said, is known as Keli Yakar because that is the name of his most popular, most well-known book. He wrote several books. The name Keli Yakar comes from a pasuk in Mishlei, Yesh Zahav V'Rav Pininim V'Cho Keli Yakar Sifsei Das. There is gold and there is the precious gemstones, or pininim are really pearls, but lips of wisdom are a precious vessel. Keli Yakar Sifsei Das. So his famous work is called Keli Yakar, got it right here. And he subsequently wrote another book called Sifsei Das, but never caught on quite as much. Sifsei Das being the last words of that verse. I think it's possibly a bit more of the same, and Keli Yakar is his primary legacy. So if you look right in front of in the middle of the page that you have in front of you, so you'll see that facsimile. It's a page of the famous classic Mikraos Gedolos. That is the collection of classic commentaries that appear on the on the page of the Chumash that has become very popular and very reprinted many times. And there you can see the most, let's say, influential and most famous commentaries. And our hero for tonight, Keli Yakar, is in the lower left. Just to tell you who else you're looking at on that page. Actually, the facing page would have Rashi and some other ones, but this page that you see in front of you, you have at the top the Yonasan Ben Uziel. That's the Aramaic Midrashic translation. You have Bal HaTurim is below that. To the left of that one is Rashbam, the grandson of Rashi. Then Ibn Ezra, who we spoke about actually previously here in this NER series. You've got Ramban there to the left. To the lower right is Or HaChaim, who's going to be our subject next week. And then, as I said, our subject for tonight, Keli Yakar. So his renown, his fame, his influence owes much to the fact that the publishers chose to include him among the very elite commentaries to be printed on the page of the Chumash, which of course makes it so much more accessible, because otherwise you would have to go out and buy a separate volume. Having said that, you can see, even though it's not intended for study, what you have in front of you, but you can see the print is kind of small and it's all that kind of ominous Rashi script doesn't appeal to everybody. So now they have reprinted Keli Yakar in 2 volumes on a standalone volume, and I'll just pass it around. You can see it has a nice typeface and it's very accessible. For some reason, I can't even remember why. I also bought another one. Maybe one of my kids got it for a bar mitzvah and it was a castaway surplus, so it came down to me possibly. And this is even nicer, it has nikudot as well, and it has the references, and it makes it, as I say, all the more accessible. And to make matters even more appealing, maybe to some people in this room, it has also been rendered into English. Now, I've got a feeling it's not an exhaustive English rendition, but it is available. It's published. It was translated by someone called Elihu Levine, and it's published by Targum Press. And I think that it probably is still available. So that's just by way of introduction, really, to our subject. His name is a bit confusing. I'll tell you why in a moment. There is confusion. He's normally regarded as Rabbi Shlomo Ephraim Ish Lunchitz or Mi Lunchitz, or just Lunchitz as a surname. Now, Lunchitz is a little town in Poland. According to Wikipedia, they've got about 13,000 population today. In his day, it was probably a fraction of that. It's in the vicinity of Lodz and is right in the very center of Poland. We presume he was born there because he's known as Ish Lunchitz. His father was called Aharon, and his real name, his given name, was Ephraim. And therefore, he wrote a commentary, one of his popular commentaries, although not as renowned as Yakar, is called Olalos Ephraim. Olalos Ephraim, like the grapes of Ephraim. And he would always write his name, sign his name Ephraim. But he writes in the intro to one of his books that in 1601, before Purim, he took ill, gravely ill, and they added a name. They added the name Shlomo. So he became known after that, because he did recover from his illness, he became known as Shlomo Ephraim. Some places I've seen it written Ephraim Shlomo, because Ephraim was really his principal name. Shlomo was just added on. So it's not completely clear if it was added on as a first name or a middle name. Often when someone is ill, they will add a name like Chaim or Yosef Chaim or something associated with life. Shlomo is a lovely name, and Shlomo means peace. I suspect that they gave him the name Shlomo because of his great Rebbe. He learned from Rav Shlomo Luria, known as Maharshal, in Lublin. Maharshal is a very important, very influential personality, quoted often by the Ramah, by other classic commentaries, the Shach and the Taz. They all quote the Rashal. Often is Machmir, occasionally he's lenient, often goes his own way. But he was very influential, very prominent, very esteemed personality. And our subject, we'll call him Keli Yakar as a shorthand, studied with Maharshal. He was primarily a disciple of Maharshal, of Rav Shlomo Luria of Lublin, and maybe that's why that is the name that was added in his illness. Now, looking at the upper left-hand portion of this page, where you have a little bit of biographical info. So, as I said, we presume he was born in Lunchitz in central Poland, 1550. Now, I have not been able to find any definitive evidence for when he was born, and most of the sources suggest 1550. My theory is it was just conjecture, meaning from what he writes about himself and about his age, they speculate he was born around 1550. I think it was only conjecture. Now, something interesting about the date of his death. He is buried in Prague. He died in Prague in 1619. He is actually buried only a few meters away from the superstar of the Prague cemetery, Maharal of Prague. And he's buried, not far away, which is not surprising because Maharal died, for those who are here in our lecture, I'm sure you remember, 1609. Maharal died in 1609, and he died only 10 years later. He was a Rav, a distinguished Rav in Prague. We'll consider shortly what role he actually had in Prague. So he's buried only a few meters away. Some of the sources indicate, such as Wikipedia, if you ever heard of Wikipedia, that he died on the 21st of April, 1619. But that is a mistake. He died on the 21st of February, 1619, and he died on the 7th of Adar, 7th of Adar Sheni. And actually, I was able to track down the source of Wikipedia error, but that's neither here nor there. The exact date is not important, but I just want to say you can't believe everything you read in Wikipedia. He was, as I said, he passed away on the 7th of Adar, also the yard site, as we know, of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Adar Sheni, 69. And just another little footnote here, little parentheses. Some sources say that he died, as I've indicated, on the 21st of February. But other sources say he died on the 2nd of March. Now, you might say you can easily determine whether the 7th of Adar was, February 21 or March 3. It's not so simple, because don't forget that Pope Gregory in 1582 introduced the reform to the Julian calendar, and that is the Gregorian calendar. And it took a number of years, actually generations, before his addition of 10 days to the calendar took hold. So if you look it up on a computer, it will tell you the 21st of February. But actually, at the time, they hadn't bought in to the Gregorian calendar yet, and therefore it will say the 3rd of March. Or I would say that the Gregorian calendar was the 3rd of March, but they hadn't bought into it yet. So for them, it was the 21st. Okay, that's just by the by. Who was our subject for tonight? The interesting answer is that we have limited biographical information about him, and a certain proportion of what we're going to discuss tonight, which I hope we will all enjoy, are some selections from his writings, which in a way is more important than exactly when he died in Gregorian and Julian calendar, is what did he teach us? What is his legacy? What wisdom do we derive from him today? What inspiration? So to speak, in what ways does he enrich our lives and our understanding of the Torah? And we will get to that. The biographical information about him in terms of his family, his background, his parents, even his wife or his children, all of that is shrouded in mystery. We know his father was called Aharon. It's interesting that in terms of his rabbinic career, he was a Rosh Yeshiva in Lviv or Lemberg in around the age of 50, around the year 1600 or 1601. He was the Rosh Yeshiva in Lviv. It seems that before that, he did not have a rabbinical post. So he must have been in business in some way. However, he was clearly very talented, very brilliant. His first sefer was published in 1580. Now you do the math. If he was born in 1550, he published a sefer in 1580. He was a young man. Interestingly to me, it was published in Basel. It's quite interesting. He at that time was in Yaroslav in Poland, and he published his sefer in Basel. Not every town had a printing press, not like here, you've got a photocopy or something like that, or, you can e-publishing and all of that. In those days, a printing press and the license to print books, especially Hebrew books, was a limited availability. And evidently, which is interesting to me, they had a Jewish Hebrew printing press. Actually, it was not necessarily Jewish. Some of them were run by Christians, but it was a Hebrew printing press that was licensed by the government and by the censors and everything to print Hebrew books. And he printed it in Basel in 1580. What's fascinating is that he writes in the introduction that he wrote it in Yaroslav, and he says that I did not have access to Sfarim there. And whatever I wrote, I had to do from memory. Now, I'm sure he had a Chumash, he must have had a Tanakh, but he probably did not have a Shas. Maybe he had some tractates, didn't have others, and he quoted everything, the Midrashic citations and other authorities, he cited them by heart. And I don't know if you want to say the proof to it, but it's evident that way, because often the citations are imprecise. So he gets the gist of it, but he cites it from memory and he paraphrases sometimes. But again, remarkable, a young man in his 20s, probably not even in a rabbinic position, maybe a bit of spare time, and he was writing a learned treatise from memory. Maharshal probably recognized the talent in his young disciple. And my theory is that it was Maharshal who encouraged the Rabbanim in Vad Harba Artzos to invite young Ephraim Lunchitz to give a drasha. He was a brilliant orator. He was a captivating presence, and he spoke with verve, with passion, with conviction. He laced into his audience in the manner of the late medieval rabbis, not so much the 21st century rabbis, not myself in any case, not my style. So you're safe tonight with me. I don't know what other rabbis you have here. Maybe some of them are more, aggressive. But he was drunk, but he had always a lovely manner as well, as we shall see. So he gave some drashas when the Rabbanim and the prominent members of the community would meet in Lublin, which was the sort of center of the Vad Harba Artzos, the Council of the Four Lands. This was a kind of quasi self-governing body that the Jews of Poland and that whole region looked to for direction, for legislation, and the governmental authorities. It suited them to allow the Jews some limited form of self-government. So he would give drushes there, and he must have wowed all the rabbis, and they probably are the ones who suggested that he should take up this position as Rosh Yeshiva in Lvov. It didn't last too long, because in 1604, he was summoned to come to Prague. There's even a legend the Maharal wrote in his will and such, which is not possible. The legend can't be true, because Maharal only died in 1609, and he came to Prague in 1604. So this legend, which I read in course of my research for tonight, has to be apocryphal, that he wrote in his will, and he's the one. Anyway, so he came to Prague in 1604. And what did he do in Prague? So he was on the Beis Din, maybe the Av Beis Din. He was the Rosh Yeshiva as well. And he had that role, interestingly, only for about 3 years. I'm talking about the Beis Din. He was accompanied on the Prague Beis Din by outstanding Torah personalities. Prague was an important city. It was a wealthy city. It was an imperial city. And Maharal, we'll get to Maharal in just one moment again, but there were many great rabbis there. The Noda Yehuda would be there later on, but he was signed on the Beis Din. We have evidence that he sat together with Rabbi Yeshaya Halevi Horovitz, who is famous as writing a sefer called Shnei Luchot Habrit, known as Shla. Shnei Luchot Habrit. It's a very influential, it's kind of Kabbalah light, and very influential, quoted by the halachic authorities, by the Kabbalistic authorities. Hasidim love him. Everybody is taken with the Shla, and he lived in Prague for a number of years. He was on the Beis Din together with Rabbi Ephraim Lunchitz, our subject for tonight. But he only was, while I was on the Beis Din, for about 3 years. By the way, we find that the two of them both wrote haskamas, they wrote approbations to Yam Shel Shlomo and Bava Kama. Now, I may not impress you very much by saying that. Yam Shel Shlomo is one of the great works written by Maharshal. And he wrote Yam Shel Shlomo, Akamarcha, and Bava Kama. And these two, who were both Talmidim of Maharshal, they wrote approbations to the book. Now, when you first hear that, you think, what's going on? The Rebbe should write a haskama for the Talmud. When the Talmud writes a sefer, so his Rebbe says he's a wonderful scholar, and I've known him for many years, and the student who publishes the sefer is delighted to have haskama from the Gadol Hador. It doesn't normally go the back way around, with the Talmidim are giving haskama to the sefer of the Rebbe. The answer is that in those days, a haskama was not so much to say that this is a wonderful book, it's worth buying, but it was a kind of commercial matter to say that the publisher has the right to publish this book, and no one else has the right to publish it for a certain number of years in order to not undermine the viability of his business. The expenses in publishing a book in those days were vast, and there were instances, some notorious instances where someone published a sefer, and then a year later or a few months later, the same sefer would be published by someone else, and it would undermine the viability of it. So the haskamas in those days was often, it was kind of almost taking out a copyright to say that this person has the right to publish this and no one else can publish it for 10 years or for 20 years or something like that. In any case, as these two great rabbis, renowned rabbis in Prague, which was a prominent city, a wealthy city of scholars, so these rabbanim, when they wrote the Haskama, so it strengthened the position of the publisher of the Am Shlomo. Anyway, that's how we know that they were colleagues together. Also, when he was in Prague, during the latter years of his life, he had many Talmidim, of whom two of the famous ones are the Tosos Yom Tov. Tosos Yom Tov, who is famous for what? Who can tell me? The Perush on the Mishnah. The Tosos Yom Tov, Rabbi Yom Tov Lipman Halevi Heller. And he was a Talmud of the Maharal and also a Talmud of Kli Yakar. And he wrote a very important Perush on Mishnayos, all Mishnayos. Tosos Yom Tov, any bar mitzvah boy who's a proper bar mitzvah boy would get a set of Mishnayos for his bar mitzvah with Tosos Yom Tov and others. So his other famous Talmud was the son of the Shlah. So I said they were contemporaries, they were colleagues, and he had a son, the Shlah had a son called Sheftel or Shabtai Horovitz, who wrote a number of Svarim, Vabe Hamudim and other Svarim, and Kli Yakar was the Rebbe of this son of the Shlah. So he was moving in the top echelon of Prague rabbinic personalities. But what about the big superstar of Prague? So it's been speculated, not everyone remembers that Maharal, although we always associated him with Prague, and he was born in Prague, and of course he is buried in Prague. But actually, he was a Rav in Posen for many years, and he went back and forth from Posen to Prague at least once or twice. So towards the end of his life, he actually left Prague for a long time, not just for a few months, I think for years, maybe 10 or, we don't know exactly how long, 10 or 20 years, quite a long time. He left Prague and he went to Posen. But at the end of his life, he came from Posen back to Prague. It could be that the Maharal came back in 1607. So Kli Yakar was the Av based in for 3 years, but then when the older, renowned Maharal comes back to Prague, he stepped down out of deference or pushed aside or whatever it might be. But he was not lacking for work because he still had the yeshiva to keep him busy. And they said to him, I mean, I'm kind of dramatizing or simplifying it, you need to be a darshan. You need to be a preacher. That is your, greatest talent. And he would darshan on Shabbos, probably other times as well, but especially on Shabbos and Yom Tov in Prague. And his famous commentary that we're using that name by which we know him, Kli Yakar, clearly when you read it, it is evident that these were originally presented as oral lectures. They are dramatic, they're captivating, they're kind of personal, and that he criticizes his audience in various ways. We'll get to that shortly. Just a little bit more biographical info, of which, as I said, we don't have that much. And in any case, he was a master stylist. He wrote some prayers about the, in 1611, I think it was, there was an invasion of Prague in 1611, and there were many fatalities. I'm sure some Jewish people and many other people. In the end, they rebuffed the invasion. So he wrote these like elegies about the sort of slichos regarding the suffering of those who came to harm, but also there was a celebratory component as well. My point is, I suspect, I'm only speculating here, that in Prague, when they wanted someone to record in language which was lyrical and inspiring and eloquent and elegant and sophisticated. These events, that he was the one to do it. He was a master stylist, and we'll see shortly, although in English, some examples of his insights in that connection. Just to go through the rest of the short paragraph that you have in front of you, famous Talmudist, author of Yam Shel Shlomo, was his Rebbe, the Marshal. After leading the yeshiva in Lvov, he was appointed rabbi in Prague, spellbinding orator. He inspired his listeners with fiery sermons, which were published. His most important work is Yakar. Now, this Ololos Ephraim that he wrote, and some of his other Sforim, are in a similar style, but they tend to be longer, like sermons, extended sermons, essays. And if a person wants to study an essay, great, more power to him. But you need a bit of effort to do that. You need to sit down with a bit of time and a bit of determination. If you have something like Yakar, which is published on the Chumash, his comments are shorter, a paragraph, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs, maybe a page or two max. Usually shorter than that. And my theory is that he's best known by this commentary, Yakar, because it's written in more bite-sized pieces. It's not like Rashi, who writes, half a sentence, he's a master of brevity. Or even Ramban, who is mostly interested in Parshanut, but he elaborates more. But because of that, it's fascinating, because he derives a Musar aspect, a Musar Haskel, a lesson. So let's take a quick look at some examples of that. And that's what the page that you have in front of you. So here's some selections from his commentary. In Bereshis, by the sweat of your brow will you eat bread until you will return to the ground, for it was from the ground that you were taken. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. Bezeyas apecha tochal lecha, with the sweat of your brow. So clearly, this is a kind of, to put it simply, a curse. Adam is cursed with mortality, and whereas living in Gan Eden, initially he did not have to exert or labor for his daily bread, that is all going to change. So look at what Yakar says about it. By the sweat of your brow, this passage supports the opinion of the physicians, who said that before sitting down to eat, you should do some physical work to raise your temperature, since that promotes the digestive process, a bit of exercise. This is in line with the verse, when you eat the labor of your hands, you are praiseworthy and as well with you. Yagia kapecha kitochal. When you exert yourself and you produce the labor of your hands and you eat, ashrecha v'tovlach, then it will go well with you. Then he says, we have another pasuk, be'etzev tildi banim, in anguish shall you eat from it all the days of your life. I'm sorry, not tildi banim is the anguish of childbirth. It says, in anguish shall you eat from it, be'it savon tochlena kol yemei chayecha. So he says, and here's a bit of Musar, I was going to say for all of us, I'll say for myself at least. He says, with anguish, he says it denotes toil. The phrase, all the days of your life, indicates that you should eat only as much as you need to sustain life and not indulge in excessive eating. Meaning you should eat so that you have length of days. You should eat so that you'll be healthy, but don't indulge. He wasn't talking here about, people who are, how can I put it, Weight Watchers. He wasn't about that. He was talking about people who indulge in expensive food, lavish food, rich food, costly food, who are sort of a conspicuous consumption, people who flaunt their wealth. He was very down, naturally, I say, because this is the manner of rabbis, on wealthy balabatim who neglect the Torah, who think because they're so prosperous that they can rule the roost and they can tell everybody what to do. I just a few sentences from one of the sources that kind of summarize or exemplifies his style. His sermons shed much light on the religious and communal life of the Polish Jewish community of his time. He railed against the wealthy members of the congregation whose passion for money and luxury caused them to withhold assistance from their needy brethren, and he criticized their pretensions to spiritual and religious status on the basis of their commercial success. That's why I say he laced into his listeners. He said that wealth corrupts and destroys the character of men when they do not appreciate its purpose. At the same time, he complained about the poor who wish to enjoy the charity of the rich without making any effort to provide for their needs. So he was not so much in favor of the welfare state either. He uses the expression a few times I saw in his commentary, ha'ivrim asher b'machane ha'ivrim, the blind who are in the camp of the Hebrews. Of course, it's a pun. And he's saying the people who are fixated, the poor person who's fixated on the charity that others owe him, and he's not motivated to endeavor himself. And if you offer him work, he says, nah, it's too difficult at work, I'm looking for something else. And in the meantime, he's living on benefits. Has a very contemporary ring to it. I'm not going to get political before the elections, but this is very interesting how he criticizes the rich plenty, but he's got some words of rebuke for the mendicants, for the beneficiaries of the largesse of the wealthy as well. He also criticizes the pilpul method, which maybe is partly to show off a person's, Talmudic erudition and his intellectual brilliance, but it doesn't contribute to the clarity of the understanding of the text, doesn't contribute to really understanding the genuine intent of the Mishnah or the Talmud or the Torah itself. So he kind of is into the practical. Does it make you a better person, a more sensitive person, a more caring person, a more honest person, a more God-fearing person? And those are the values and those are the qualities which he seeks to promote in his listeners or in his readers. I saw in one of the sources that I used for our preparation tonight, although this is actually the same source that has this legend, which I told you is completely mythological, but he quotes here a little excerpt from one of his Svarim. The Talmud says, why is it that we find that some learned people, their children are not learned, their children are amaratzim? Why is it that we find? So the Gemara says, Shelo birchu b'Torah tchila, because they didn't make a bracha on the Torah first. So the simple understanding is they didn't appreciate the Torah enough, and therefore they didn't transmit it to the next generation. But the literal meaning, they didn't make a blessing on the Torah first, is very difficult to understand. Everyone who sits down to learn Torah, or even when we first wake up in the morning, we say Birchas HaTorah. By the way, it's a mitzvah for women as well as men to say the blessings of the Torah. I'm not just saying when a person is called to the Torah. The blessings of the Torah, we say every morning. It's the first pages of your Siddur. It's actually a mitzvah min HaTorah for women as well as men. So what does the Gemara mean when it says, Shelo birchu b'Torah tchila? They didn't make a bracha on the Torah before they studied. Has a beautiful drash. He says that a person who loves Torah, he values Torah. Torah for him is the most precious aspect of his life, the most precious gift, and he wants to transmit it to his children. So he blesses his son that you should love Torah, you should be a Torah scholar, you should be toil in Torah, and you should have success in your learning. Of course, like we say, the Mishnah says, in ein kemach, ein Torah. If there's no flour, then there's no Torah. You need parnasa as well. So he'll also give his son a bracha. You should have parnasa, you should be prosperous, you should be successful, you should have ample financial resources. But he emphasizes the Torah first. But the other guy, he's only interested in money. He blesses his child, you should be wealthy, you should be like the next Bill Gates or Elon Musk, whoever you want to be, that's what you should be. And you should also learn Torah too. So, Shelo birchu b'Torah tchila, it means they didn't give the bracha for Torah primacy. They transmitted the bracha. When they gave the children a bracha, they gave a bracha about Torah, but it wasn't first. First was money, success, fame, renown. You should get into a good law school and be hired with one of those flashy, city law firms, and you should be a partner and have your name in lights. And you should also do a bit of Torah study on the side. So Shelo birchu b'Torah tchila, because they didn't value the Torah primarily, initially. Okay, it's a beautiful drash which he mentions. Let's take a look now in the upper right here on the page. they will fill your palaces and the houses of your officials and all of Egypt. It will be something that your fathers and your fathers' fathers have never seen since they were in the land. So this, of course, is the plague of the frogs. Malu vatecha avadecha v'chol Mitzrayim. So he asks a very good question. He says, without doubt, the king's palace is more impregnable than the houses of the officials, and the houses of the officials are better insulated than those of all Egypt. So why does the pasuk say that the frogs are going to penetrate and they're going to be in your house in the palace, and all of the high-ranking officials as well, and also all of Egypt? Now, I mean, there's a simple answer for it. That's why I say it's derech drash. The simple answer is Moshe is speaking to Paro, and he wants to intimidate Paro. He's threatening Paro, and he's saying to Paro, it's going to affect you and those close to you and all of Egypt. But nevertheless, if you think about it, which he's pointing out, in terms of how protected the palace is, probably it's going to be less vulnerable than the other. It's going to be less vulnerable, better protected. So he should have said they're going to infiltrate all the houses of Egypt, and even the upper echelons who live in gated communities, and they've got much better insulation. They're also, and even the palace itself. Why is it the opposite order? So look what he says. Then how are we to understand that the locust, I said the frogs comes to me, the locust would strike the most fortified house first, and only after that the unprotected houses? It can only be due to miraculous intervention. As the sin had progressed, so did the punishment. For Pharaoh was one who initiated the persecution, and subsequently he was emulated by his officials and his people. Perhaps this reverse order is what is meant by the verse. Never before had there been such a locust plague. This is a beautiful drash, because remember that the Mefarshim struggle to actually validate this statement in the Torah. Never before was there such a locust plague, and never will there be after. Because in the book of Yoel, the whole short book of Yoel, one of the 12 minor prophets, is all about a plague of locusts, and there it says the same thing. It was the most multifaceted and all that. So the Mefarshim struggled to say, well, there were different types of locusts. In Egypt was only a single type of locust. So according to this beautiful drash, he suggests what was unique. The reason the pasuk says never before, never since was there such a plague of locusts. Why? Because this plague of locusts was unique. Since Pharaoh was most at fault, the locust affected him first. The officials were next in line in their guilt, in their complicity, so they were affected next. The rest, the rank and file of the Egyptians, their complicity was at a lower level, so they were affected last. So maybe that was the uniqueness of it, because again, naturally, if there are innumerable locusts around, they're going to first get into the houses with the broken windows or where they don't have proper insulation, etc. But in this case, it was the opposite, because it was for a didactic purpose. It was for the purpose of illustrating and punishing Pharaoh. So again, I think it's very clever. It's not probably exactly the pshat, but it's not wildly distant from the pshat either. And as I say, it helps also to explain this statement in the Torah. Never before was there such a plague of locusts, because this was very special, this plague in which the most protected facility, the palace, actually suffered first and most, etc. I want to mention a comment of, it's not here because we do the one here also, we've got still a few more minutes, from this week's Parsha. So in this week's Parsha, Parshas Kedoshim, we have one of the very famous psukim in all of the Torah, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Of course, much has been written about it. Let me tell you what Yakar says about this pasuk. So he quotes the very famous, again, one of the most famous passages in all the Talmud, of the prospective ger who wanted to become Jewish, learn the whole Torah on one foot. And Shammai drove him away, and he came to Hillel, and Hillel said, I'll help you, I'll tell you. that which is hateful to you, don't do to your neighbor. Of course, he's telling him what Rabbi Kippur says, Klal Gadol b'Torah, v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. What's it all about? So Yakar says, this prospective convert, he says, I don't think that he was there to mock or to somehow scorn or, make fun of the rabbis. He was genuine. He wanted to learn the Torah, but not literally as he stood on one foot. He wanted to learn the Torah in a way that would be easily accessible. He said, look, I haven't grown up with the values of the Torah, the teachings of the Torah. I'm probably a heathen, but I want to become Jewish. I love the Jewish people. I love the God of Israel. Tell me the principles of the Torah on one pillar, or possibly one pillar per category. This is his suggestion. So, v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, he says, that means love your neighbor as yourself. What's hateful to you, don't do to someone else. Idech perusha, zil gemor. The rest of his commentary, go and learn. So he says, Yakar says, that he told him the last part of the pasuk. Who can tell me, how does the pasuk end? V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. Really, that's the middle of the pasuk. It's a blockbuster pasuk, that one. The last words are, Ani Hashem, I am God. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, Ani Hashem, I am God. So, Yakar says the following. The man came to Hillel and said, teach me the Torah as I stand on one foot. The meaning was, teach me the Torah on one pillar. Encapsulate it for me in a way that I can grasp, that I can use as the foundation for my study and embrace of all of the commandments of the Torah. So we know that there are commandments, bein Adam lechavero and bein Adam lamakom. So the essence, the foundational principle of the mitzvahs bein Adam lechavero, between man and his fellow, is don't do to someone else what you don't want to be done to you. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. There are many other mitzvahs in that category that derive from it, but that's the principle. Ani Hashem, that is the principle of belief in God. That's the principle of mitzvahs being Adam lamakom. Of course, there are a lot of them, but if you distill it down to the essence, like it says, Tzadik b'emanoso yichyeh, so that is the basis for it. Zil gemor, that's why I told him, go and learn. You've asked for it, on one foot, on one pillar. So I give it you on two pillars, meaning one pillar for ben Adam lamakom, one pillar for ben Adam lechavero. You've got the foundations, now go and learn. And that's, I think, is a very beautiful, interpretation. It's not far from the pshat. And I once said this many, many years ago. A certain rabbi who was there, he was impressed with it, but it wasn't my own Torah, it was from Yakar. Got a lot of other wisdom from him as well. And I'm going to tell you one other before we do actually we'll do the last one here, and then I'll tell you one last one about pay as well. So the lower right, this one is pertinent a bit to the season now, because it's a reference here to the counting of the Omer and approaching the festival of Shavuos. Then you shall count 7 complete weeks after the day following the Passover festival, when you brought the Omer as a wave offering, until the day after the 7th week, when there will be a total of 50 days, you shall present a new meal offering to God. So one of the perplexing questions about the festival that we call Shavuos is, why do we not find in the Torah a reference to the fact that this festival celebrates and coincides on the calendar with the giving of the Torah? We celebrate Shavuos as Zman Matan Torah Seinu, but the Torah doesn't tell us that. It is evident from a consideration of the sequence of the days. The Torah says Shavuos is 50 days after Pesach, or rather, after 49 days, the 50th day is Shavuos. And it is clear chronologically this was a day of giving of the Torah. Why doesn't the Torah itself say? The Torah only identifies it as a new offering. What's the new offering, by the way, on Shavuos? What's new about it? In the agricultural cycle, so Pesach is the new offering of the barley, and Shavuos is a new offering of the wheat. It's the beginning of the wheat harvest. That's why it's called Mincha Chadasha, because the wheat is the main harvest that we look forward to, and it doesn't happen yet in the land of Israel, in the early part of the spring or summer, but only in Shavuos. So that's Mincha Chadasha. So Yakar sees in that expression, Mincha Chadasha, a new offering, a remez to the giving of the Torah. Look what he says. Here is an allusion to the giving of the Torah on Shavuos. For everyone should experience the Torah as something new each day, as though he had received it on Mount Sinai this very day. The reason why the Torah does not explicitly mention the fact that on Shavuos the Torah was given, I've explained in my treatise Olol HaSifraim that we mentioned earlier. God did not wish to set aside a particular day for this purpose, because on every day of the year, a Jew should feel as though he received the Torah on Mount Sinai. If the Torah emphasized that Shavuos is the day when we celebrate receiving the Torah, so you know what could happen? We could learn Torah on Shavuos once a year. So, of course, we do learn Torah on Shavuos, we may stay up all night learning, but the Torah itself was cautious about associating Shavuos with the time to celebrate receiving the Torah. On Pesach, we eat matzah for 7 days, or 8 days in Chutzatz. We eat matzah the rest of the year if we feel like it, but most of us don't feel like it that much. I mean, maybe from time to time. Sukkos, we dwell in a sukkah during those days. We don't dwell in Sukkot other days of the year. So to speak, Hashem didn't want Shavuos to be that way as well. We learn Torah on Shavuos, and we don't get too much involved in it the rest of the year. This is his suggestion. But he goes further. He says that's why it's called Mincha Chadasha, the novelty, the enthusiasm, the excitement, the sense that this is something which is, exciting. That is the essence of our relationship with the Torah. Mincha Chadasha, the novelty. Just as a baby always finds new taste in his mother's milk, so does everyone who contemplates the Torah find new insights each day. Although he doesn't say it here, but this also is a remez to why we eat dairy foods on Shavuos, because milk is the food of an infant. And we could say Matan Torah is the infancy of the Jewish people, but there's something further here as well, which is what he's alluding to, that an infant never tires of its mother's milk. You never find an infant who's, a few months old saying, milk again, can't we order out Chinese? What about sushi? Why do we have milk every time? Nothing but milk. And the infant finds every flavor, every nutrient, every satisfaction, every satiation, everything that it requires for its health and for its growth is in its mother's milk. So this is why, he doesn't say it here, but he's alluding to it, that just as a baby always finds new taste in his mother's milk, so does everyone who contemplates the Torah find new insights each day. It doesn't get old and just, repetitive and boring. Someone who studies the Torah, who delves into it, who exerts himself or herself to find new relevance and new applicability to my life and my circumstances will find it every time. Thus, to a student of the Torah, every day is Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. Therefore, other than in the allusion, the new meal offering, the day of the giving of the Torah is not mentioned. I'd just like to end with one last thought of Kli Yakar, a very beautiful idea. In Devarim, in chapter 4, verse 9, the Perek Dalet Pasuk, we have the Pasuk, Hishamer lecha ushmor nafshecha ma'od, pen tishkachas hadvarim asher ra'u einecha, etc. Guard yourself and be very cautious to your soul, meaning be very alert, pen tishkach, lest you forget. Now, I want to read you a few of those words again, because he makes a beautiful drash here on the gematria of the Roshei Tevos. Hishamer lecha ushmor nafshecha ma'od. Now, this is a slightly nuanced gematria, so stay with me. Hishamer lecha ushmor nafshecha ma'od. So the hey of Hishamer, the lamed of lecha, we're going to get back to. We have the vav ushmar nafshecha ma'od. So I'll tell you the letters again. You tell me the value, the numerical value. Hey, vav, nun, mem. Hey, vav, nun, mem. What's the gematria of those letters? 101. Very good, Daniel. It's good that you're here. So Hey is 5, of course, Vav is 6, Nun is 50, Mem is 40, 101. Says Yakar. The Gemara says, Eino Dome, Hashona Pirko Mea Pa'amim, Lishana'o Mea Ve'echad Pa'amim. That a person who studied a certain subject 100 times cannot be compared in his grasp of the material to someone who studied it 101 times. Meaning that even a person who's reviewed a subject repeatedly, but if you review it again, you'll understand it better, you'll remember it better. So he says like this, that the difference between Zachar and Shachach. Zachar is to remember. Shachach is to forget. So Zachar in Gematria is 227. Shachach, to forget, in Gematria is Shachach, Shin, Chaf, Ches, 328. So the difference between Zachar is 227 and Shachach is 328. It's 101. The 101 is the difference between remembering and forgetting. What about the Lamed? He says Lamed. It means Lamed. Study your passage, your Torah subject. Lamed 101 times, and that's the difference between Zachar and Shachach. So this is how he explains the pasuk. Of course, derech drash, but a very elegant drash, I think. Be very cautious, for your soul, lest you forget the things which your eyes saw and which your ears beheld in receiving the Torah. So these are a few examples of the teachings, of the writings of Yakar. As I said before, he was a master orator, but we can see that he had the depth and the creativity, and he also had the courage to lace into his audience. When you read it, then I suppose you don't squirm in your seat the same way, but maybe you imagine, all those rich balabatim sitting in the audience, and he's lacing into them and that sort of thing. But it makes for fascinating reading, enjoyable reading, stimulating reading. And look, I hope that for myself at least, and for all of us, that we also take to heart and we derive some of those lessons, and we actually emerge from our studies of Yakar and all the Mefarshim, but he's our subject for tonight, not only more enlightened and more informed, but more refined and more uplifted, and with a deeper understanding of our relationship with Hashem. And the Mitzvah Hashem will discover more commentaries in the weeks to come. Thank you very much.
It sounds like he doesn't fancy supporting money and very, very opinionated.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something about he was Rosh Hashiva.